Welcome to a special episode of Sustainability Forward, our podcast, where we discuss the major issues surrounding sustainability. With me today is my co host Carmine, but we have a special guest today, Andrew. Andrew is the Managing Director for Policy at the Women Business Coalition and has had experience working with the OECD. But Andrew's just come back from COP28 in Dubai and is going to share his experience from COP with us today. Carmine, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, so welcome. I think we are very excited today to have this episode, Sustainability Forward, the podcast. Very excited because we're fresh from great. We have a great speaker today, so Andrew Prag, a lot of experiences in previous COP, and also now coming back from Dubai. So, Andrew, welcome to the show.
Great. Well, thank you very much to both of you. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Good. Andrew, please tell us a little bit more about your experiences. You have been working a few years in this kind of domains. You are now with the Women Business Coalition. Give us a couple of words, please,
Sure, thanks.
on your background. Thank you.
Unfortunately, it's a bit more than a few years, which makes me feel very old. But so yes, I'm currently a managing director of policy at the We Mean Business Coalition. And what we do at this coalition is, so we're an NGO, but working internationally with the world's most influential businesses to push for more action on climate change, both from the business side, but also making sure that those businesses are pushing policymakers to do more on the policy side. So my role is to really lead a team that makes this interface between business and policy, always getting the most ambitious businesses, getting them out to make their voice heard in front of policymakers to move things in the right direction and basically speak louder than the negative lobbyists who are trying to slow things down. So that's what we do in this coalition. For me personally, it's a bit of a change because for many years I was working in climate policy and energy policy and environment policy with both the OECD and the IEA in Paris for about 12 years. And before that, I was in the private sector with Shell in the energy domain, but then also in the carbon markets and in renewables project development. So all that time, I've been following these COPs for many years, about 15 years. I've been going on and off to different COPs. So I've seen different types, different emphasis, different successes and failures. And this COP was quite unusual in many ways, which I'm sure we'll get onto when we get into the discussion.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. No, that's great. Rishi, please.
Yeah. So Andrew, maybe let's start there, right? Could you give us sort of your overall thoughts on the COP this year? You've had experience from the COPs in the past as well. What was the general atmosphere like? What are your thoughts on this year's COP?
Yeah, it was very unusual, as I said, and it's partly unusual for the sheer scale of the thing and who was there and who was participating outside of the negotiations. But maybe we'll come back to that in a moment, because what I really want to talk about first is the actual formal outcomes and what happened in the intergovernmental negotiation, which at the end of the day is at the heart of these processes. There was a lot of pressure on this COP because for two reasons. One is that it comes at a particular moment in the implementation of the Paris Agreement, which is, of course, the main international treaty that countries signed in 2015 to get all countries committing to action on climate change and to guide that process. And this was a particular landmark because it was the culmination of what we call the global stocktake, which is a formal part of the Paris Agreement that forces all of the countries to take stock every 5 years of where they've got to, how the progress is on climate change action and what needs to be done. So this COP had to deliver a formal outcome of that first global stocktake. That was the first reason it was particular. And the second one is because of where it was hosted. And of course, United Arab Emirates, a major oil and gas producer, they chose as president of the COP the CEO of ADNOC, the national oil company in the UAE, and that, of course, provided a significant overtone to negotiations, given their obvious interest in oil and gas, and in much debate over the last 12 months about what this would mean for the tone of the negotiations and what the presidency of the COP would be able to deliver. So it's particular for those two reasons. Now, a lot of the discussion and the headlines on the outcome is focused on the issue of what this agreement said about fossil fuels. Why is that important? Because it's pretty striking that in now 30 years of climate negotiations, the texts have never really addressed the question of burning fossil fuels, which, as anyone who's looked at science knows, is at the heart of the issue. Now, finally, at this COP, after much fraught negotiation, which went right down to the wire, literally the middle of the night of the last day, or even the day after the COP was supposed to finish, finally it came out with some text that talks about a transition away from fossil fuels, which doesn't sound like much to a casual observer, and many people would say, "Oh, but that's not the strong language we wanted," and what does it really do? But it really sends a strong signal that all the countries of the world have now agreed that this is the backdrop to the direction of travel, and that really matters for the signal that it sends. Even if it's not like a legally binding agreement or anything like that, it's important for the signal that it sends. So there's many other things that were agreed at this COP, but the one that everyone's focusing on is that one.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Andrew. So I think we're 197 countries. So finally, as you said, for the first time, there was an alignment. Probably the first time that fossil fuels were mentioned in this kind of language ever in COPs.
Yes, which when you look at the science is quite striking that it's taken this long to get all the countries to agree on that, which is why it's significant.
Good. So we talk about probably the main takeaway. What are your highlights or some of the lowlights also around this COP? Do you think there are still some pending issues that this COP didn't address?
Yes, no, absolutely. So, and as I said, the focus has been around this question of fossil fuels, but if you're talking about highlights, and I guess that the fact that this suddenly they came through with this text in the last minute, when even a few hours before it looked like it was going to fall apart, and that they might end up with no outcome, was a significant possibility just a few hours before this text landed. So I guess that was a highlight. But there are many other things agreed here. So other elements are there are quite a few. Well, maybe I'll start saying in this global stocktake text itself, there are other significant things. So one is this agreement to triple renewable energy globally and double the rate of improvement of energy efficiency.
Yeah.
First time we've seen targets like that signed up. And I don't want to spend too long going into the detail, but another important element in this stocktake that's been a bit less discussed is that it now actually puts a bit more guidance on what countries have to do when they put forward their national commitments, which they have to do every 5 years. And then now it says that it has to be economy-wide commitments covering all the different greenhouse gases, not just CO2. That actually made quite a difference, particularly for the big emerging economies that didn't have that requirement before. So that helps to put the guardrails in place to get more ambitious commitments from countries. Because at the end of the day, when I talked about signals earlier, the signal matters, but what really moves things is the national policies and regulations that countries implement within their borders. So having them put forward their new commitments, which are stricter and more ambitious, really helps for them to then put in place the regulations, the policies, the incentives necessary to get the investment flowing into those technologies, and that's what really moves things. So that was also important. The other thing I would say is there was a lot of what I like to call the extracurricular activities at this COP, which means countries coming together to put forward pledges and declarations which are not part of the official negotiations, meaning that countries can voluntarily sign up to them or not. It's not a thing where all 197 countries have to agree, and they're not necessarily binding, but they can be a useful signal. So just to mention one, which is called the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Accelerator, I think it's its official title, which brings together not just international oil companies, but also the national oil companies, state-owned oil companies, to make commitments notably on their methane emissions, which is a very important greenhouse gas, and also on their own operational emissions. And it remains to be seen whether they can be held accountable to those commitments. But still, it's for the first time it brings on board the big national oil companies like the Saudi Aramcos and so on to actually have a commitment on paper, which is quite interesting. So again, there's many more things. I don't want to go into everything, but the one other thing I would mention is there's a big step forward on what we call loss and damage as well, which is this notion that the countries, the more vulnerable countries in the world that will be suffering some of the worst impacts of climate change will be able to access a fund to help them repair and recover from the damages of those extreme climate events. This was agreed in principle last year, but is now operationalized and actually funded, with capitalized with some several $100 million, and that was a big step forward that actually happened on the first day of the COP, unusually, and helps to build trust. Because a lot of these negotiations, at the end of the day, it's about trust between countries and the sort of feeling in the room, and getting the developing countries to understand that there was a real commitment and money in the loss and damage fund helps to move things along in the rest of the negotiations.
Andrew, one question maybe is that we constantly hear is, whether is COP doing the things that it needs to do? But you've mentioned quite a few interesting highlights. But what are some of the things that, at least going into it, you thought the COP should have achieved, but it wasn't achieved for one reason or the other? What are some of those missing elements from this COP?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sorry, I didn't answer Carmene's question on that earlier. So there always could be more. So, for example, the more progressive countries were pushing for the language and fossil fuels to be able to phase out very specifically, and that had to be compromised to get the agreement. But also they were pushing to have this explicit commitment for when emissions are going to peak globally. That also had to be compromised out. And that's just part of the give and take of any multilateral negotiation.
Right.
But a notable thing which actually failed to deliver at this COP was on carbon markets. So what's known as Article 6 in the jargon, which refers to the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which allows for countries to use a sort of UN-approved system of carbon credits to help countries meet their commitments, and then find the most cost-effective actions for achieving those commitments. And they were due to agree on the final text to actually fully operationalize that process, and that actually fell down at the last minute and has not been agreed and has been kicked down to the next COP. So for those working in carbon markets looking to use that mechanism to really drive investment, that was a big disappointment, because it leaves the thing in limbo for another year. So that's a notable thing that did not deliver at this COP.
Interesting. Okay, let's maybe quickly move into the area outside of these formal negotiations. So, in the past COPs, I know there's a lot of companies, startups, different bodies displaying new solutions. New areas of innovation in climate science and things like that. What were some of the interesting new things that you saw at this, particular COP, whether it's in the area of technology, new ways of engaging, new frameworks? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So, yeah, as I said right at the beginning, one of the notable things about this COP was the sheer scale of the thing. And we mentioned the UAE and its role as an oil and gas producer, but anyone who's been to Dubai knows that it's things happen in Dubai on a mega scale. It's a sort of big, exuberant, ostentatious place, and that was also the case for this COP, and that it was massive in its scale. People talking about there being up to 100,000 people there. That's more than double the size of any previous COP, and so the big question is, well, what were those people doing? And some of them were just milling around, chatting, drinking champagne at receptions, and probably not doing much. But what I found quite exciting is that there was some real energy in bringing together these thousands of innovators, of financiers, of technology companies, of startups and stuff. And there were many different venues, not just in the official COP zone, but all around the city, actually, where there were these meetings happening, these conferences, these discussions on financing and scaling up new technologies. And that, in the end of the day, I thought was quite exciting, and probably what we need to really get the breakthroughs and the scaling up of new technologies to solve this problem. I was sort of flip-flopping each day, thinking this is just over the top. This is a little bit sort of almost abhorrent that so many people have flown here to this city to just chat about climate change. It seems like unnecessary, but then on balance, I think actually it's quite exciting that there was all of these exchanges going on, and that's new compared to previous COPs.
And I guess it also brings the consensus around the issue that you mentioned at the beginning. So a final alignment between countries, so different governments with different kind of priorities, but also companies in the energy system, from conventional energy to renewable energy, all aligned on the same path. Then we can discuss, as you stated, in terms of how this path can be accelerated. But I think we are now kind of walking together finally in the same,
Yes,
the same direction.
yeah, there's definitely a feeling of that, and that's the overall signal that the official negotiations that COP gives then helps to drive that further forward. And we've even seen some announcements in the last couple of days of big new investments that are already referencing the fact that they're listening to the signal coming out of the COP. So Octopus Energy is announcing an 800 million new funding round because of linking or referencing at least the COP outcome as a reason to be pushing further. So that's exactly the kind of signal we want to see.
Yeah. So maybe as sort of kind of the final part of this podcast, Andrew, what did you personally learn, and what were some of the main takeaways from this COP for you?
For me personally, yeah, it's a good question. And actually, so this is the first COP that I've been doing this job with the We Mean Business Coalition. Previously, I've always had a hat of sort of supporting the negotiations from the international organization side of things. And so what we do is we bring campaigns, and we bring the business voice, the ambitious business voice. And this time we had a campaign called Fossil to Clean, which is really getting business voices to sign up to say, we want to transition away from fossil fuels. We commit to do that, but we need governments to really be leading the way and to make a demand signal out of these businesses. So that's was our big thing, and got a lot of attention actually and visibility at this COP because people are looking for that business voice. So my key learning point was the power that actually these kind of advocacy, civil society campaigns can have on actually moving the needle on the government negotiations. So we were having a lot of meetings with negotiators, even with ministers, and they were saying to us, we're really listening. We hear this voice coming from business. We also hear it coming from civil society, from environmental NGOs, and it does make a difference. It does move things. So for me, that was a real insight that it matters. These kind of campaigns, getting the voice heard, it is not just background noise. It really makes a difference to what governments can do.
Interesting takeaways. Thank you. Carmine, would you help us close out this episode?
Yes, really thank you, Andrew, to come to the show. I think we learned a lot today, Richie, really in a very sharp, crisp, succinct way. Andrew, wish you all the best for your project with Women Business Coalition. Thank you for coming to the show.
No, you're welcome. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I'm wishing you both happy holidays.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Take care.
Bye-bye. Goodbye.